A millionaire forced his son to marry a humble taxi driver. His family laughed a lot. But a year later, everyone was left speechless. Subscribe to the channel to follow more exciting stories like this one. The autumn rain pelted against the windscreen of Sarah Mitchell's taxi as she navigated the winding driveway of Thornfield Manor. At 24, she hadn't imagined herself working as a private chauffeur for one of Britain's wealthiest families, but life had a way of derailing even the most carefully laid plans. Her father's illness had forced her to put her dreams of attending university on hold, and now here she was, ferrying the notorious Alexander Lancaster to and from his latest escapades. The grand Georgian mansion loomed before her, its limestone facade illuminated by carefully positioned spotlights that cut through the gathering dusk. Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the contrast between this world and her modest flat in South London, where she and her father shared a cramped two-bedroom space above a chip shop. As she pulled up to the main entrance, she spotted Richard Lancaster, the family patriarch, pacing in the portico. His presence at this hour was unusual. He typically remained sequestered in his home office until late into the night, managing the vast Lancaster Holdings empire. "Miss Mitchell," he called out as she stepped from the vehicle. "A word, if you please." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. In the 6 months she'd worked for the family, Richard Lancaster had barely acknowledged her existence. She followed him into his study, a room that perfectly embodied old money with its leather-bound books and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. "Please sit," he gestured to a leather armchair that probably cost more than her annual salary. "I have a rather unconventional proposition for you." Sarah perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the seconds as Richard Lancaster settled himself behind his massive mahogany desk. "I'll be direct, Miss Mitchell. My son Alexander is destroying himself and by extension the future of this company. His latest incident at the Savoy made the tabloids again, and our board members are growing increasingly concerned about the future leadership of Lancaster Holdings." Sarah nodded, remembering the headlines about Alexander's champagne-soaked escapade that had ended with him diving into the hotel's fountain in nothing but his boxer shorts. "I've observed you these past months," Richard continued, his grey eyes sharp and calculating. "You're intelligent, hard-working, and most importantly, you have a stabilizing influence on Alexander. He actually listens to you, which is more than I can say for anyone else in his life." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, recalling the late-night conversations she'd had with Alexander during their drives, when his carefully constructed facade would slip, revealing glimpses of the troubled young man beneath the playboy exterior. "What I'm about to propose will sound outrageous, but I ask that you hear me out completely before responding." Richard leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I want you to marry my son." Sarah's jaw dropped. She waited for the punchline, but Richard Lancaster's expression remained deadly serious. "It would be a temporary arrangement, of course, 1 year to be precise. In exchange, I will provide the best medical care available for your father's condition and fund your university education afterward. Alexander needs to prove to the board that he can be responsible, and I believe you're the perfect person to help him achieve that." The grandfather clock chimed 7 times, its sound echoing in the stunned silence that followed Richard's proposal. Sarah's mind whirled with the implications. It was mad, completely mad, and yet, "Why me?" she finally managed to ask. "Because despite your circumstances, you've maintained your integrity. You're not interested in our wealth or status. I've seen how you react to Alexander's extravagant lifestyle with disapproval rather than envy. And most importantly, you're the only person who seems to see my son as more than just the Lancaster heir." Sarah stood up abruptly, needing to move. She paced the length of the Persian carpet, her thoughts in chaos. The idea was absurd, yet she couldn't stop thinking about her father, about the specialist treatments they couldn't afford, about her deferred dreams of university. "And what does Alexander think about this arrangement?" Richard's lips twisted into a wry smile. "He'll agree to it. He may act rebellious, but he knows the importance of his position. Besides, he respects you, even if he won't admit it." Before Sarah could respond, the study door burst open, and Alexander Lancaster himself stumbled in, his designer suit rumpled and his dark hair tousled. He froze at the sight of Sarah, his green eyes widening with surprise. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he drawled, attempting to maintain his usual air of casual indifference. but Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Having a little chat with my chauffeur, Father?" "Actually, Alexander, I was just discussing your future wife." The color drained from Alexander's face as he looked between his father and Sarah. For once in his life, the notorious playboy was completely speechless. Sarah felt as though she had stepped into an alternate reality. Here she was, standing in a wood-paneled study worth more than she'd earn in a lifetime, being offered a deal that would solve all her problems, but potentially create 1,000 more. She looked at Alexander, who was now pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, his hands slightly unsteady. "This is a joke, right?" Alexander finally said, downing his drink in one gulp. "You can't seriously expect me to marry my driver? It's either this or I'll be forced to take more drastic measures regarding your position in the company," Richard replied coldly. "The board meeting is in 13 months. Prove you can be responsible until then, with a respectable marriage and proper behavior, and your future at Lancaster Holdings will be secure." The weight of the moment pressed down on Sarah as she watched father and son face off across the study. Her whole life could change with a single word. But was she willing to enter into such an arrangement? Could she really marry a man she knew only as her sometimes charming, often infuriating passenger? As if sensing her thoughts, Alexander turned to her, and for a brief moment she caught a glimpse of vulnerability in his eyes before his usual mask of cynical amusement slipped back into place. "Well, what do you say, Sarah? Fancy becoming a Lancaster?" Sarah stared at the marriage contract spread across Richard Lancaster's desk, her mind still struggling to process the surreal situation. It was 3 days after the initial proposition, and she had spent every waking moment since then wrestling with the decision. Her father's medical bills were piling up, and the opportunity to finally attend university seemed like a dream too good to pass up. But marriage? To Alexander Lancaster? "Everything appears to be in order," the family solicitor, Mr. Edwards, said as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "The terms are quite clear. 1 year of marriage, during which both parties must maintain the appearance of a legitimate relationship. All medical expenses for Mr. Mitchell will be covered, and a full university scholarship will be provided upon completion of the term." Alexander lounged in an armchair by the window, his casual posture belying the tension evident in his clenched jaw. He hadn't said much since arriving, but Sarah could feel his eyes on her as she read through the document. "And what about living arrangements?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "You'll move into the east wing of Thornfield Manor," Richard Lancaster replied. "Separate bedrooms, of course, but you must present a united front to the public. That means attending social functions together, being seen at appropriate venues, and, most importantly, no scandals." He directed this last point at his son with a pointed glare. Alexander straightened in his chair. "And what about Sarah's job? Surely you don't expect my wife to continue driving other people around London?" "Of course not." Richard waved his hand dismissively. "The position will be terminated with a generous severance package. Sarah will be enrolled in university part-time, which will explain her continued presence at the manor while maintaining her studies." Sarah's fingers traced the edge of the contract. "And my father will be transferred to the private King's Memorial Hospital tomorrow morning. The best neurologist in the country has already been consulted about his case." The grandfather clock chimed, its sound somehow more ominous than usual. Sarah looked up to find Alexander watching her intently, his expression unreadable. "Could I have a moment alone with Alexander?" she asked suddenly. Richard and Mr. Edwards exchanged glances before nodding and leaving the study. As the door closed behind them, Sarah turned to face her potential future husband. "Are you really okay with this?" she asked quietly. Alexander stood and walked to the drink cabinet, but this time he poured 2 glasses. Bringing one to Sarah, he perched on the edge of the desk beside her. "Honestly, I think it's absolutely mad," he admitted, taking a sip. "But you've seen the tabloids. My reputation is... Well, let's just say the board members aren't exactly confident in my ability to lead the company. And you care about that? More than I let on." He set his glass down with a soft clink. "Look, Sarah, I know I play the part of the careless playboy rather well, but Lancaster Holdings employs thousands of people. The company's been in my family for 4 generations. I can't be the one who ruins it all because I couldn't get my act together." Sarah studied him carefully. In all their late-night drives, all their conversations, She'd never heard him speak so candidly about his responsibilities. Besides, he continued with a hint of his usual smirk, there are worse things than being married to someone who actually calls me out on my nonsense. I thought you hated when I lectured you about responsibility. Oh, I do. But maybe that's exactly what I need right now. Sarah stood and walked to the window, watching as the gardener trimmed the immaculate hedges below. Her whole life had been about responsibility, caring for her father, working multiple jobs, saving every penny. The irony of being offered everything she'd ever wanted in exchange for teaching responsibility to someone else wasn't lost on her. What about real relationships? She asked, turning back to face him. We'd both be giving up a year of our lives, a year when we could meet someone we actually want to be with. Alexander's expression softened. Sarah, my last 3 relationships made the front page of The Sun for all the wrong reasons. A year of peace sounds rather appealing right now. She couldn't help but smile, remembering the spectacular public breakup with his last girlfriend at Royal Ascot. No more fountain diving at the Savoy? Well, I can't promise miracles, he chuckled, but then his face grew serious. Your father would get the best care available, and you'd finally get to pursue your dreams. Those are good things, Sarah. And what do you get out of this besides your father's approval? Alexander ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she'd come to recognize as a sign of genuine contemplation. Maybe a chance to prove to myself that I can be more than just tabloid fodder, that there's actually a decent businessman somewhere underneath all the bad press. Sarah picked up the contract again, reading through the terms one more time. 1 year. She could do anything for 1 year, couldn't she? And her father's health was worth any sacrifice. If we do this, she said slowly, we need to set some ground rules. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Such as? First, no more embarrassing public incidents. If we're supposed to be married, your behavior reflects on me too. He nodded, looking appropriately chastened. Second, I want to be involved in understanding the business. If I'm going to be playing the role of your wife, I should at least know what Lancaster Holdings actually does. That's actually quite sensible, he admitted, looking impressed. And third, she continued, meeting his gaze steadily, we have to be honest with each other. No games, no hidden agendas. If this is going to work, we need to trust each other. Alexander held her gaze for a long moment before extending his hand. Deal. Sarah took his hand, expecting a handshake, but instead, he turned it over and brushed his lips across her knuckles in an old-fashioned gesture that made her heart skip a beat. Might as well start practicing for the society photographers, he said with a wink, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he wasn't entirely joking. Sarah withdrew her hand, trying to ignore the lingering warmth of his touch. Shall we call them back in? Alexander nodded and moved to open the study door. As Richard and Mr. Edwards returned, Sarah picked up the pen, her hand hovering over the signature line. Last chance to back out, Alexander murmured, standing close enough that only she could hear him. Sarah took a deep breath and signed her name with a flourish. Not backing out if you're not. Alexander's signature joined hers on the contract, and just like that, Sarah Mitchell agreed to become Sarah Lancaster, at least for the next year. As Mr. Edwards began preparing copies of the contract, Richard Lancaster allowed himself a small smile. Well then, I believe we should discuss the wedding arrangements. After all, it needs to be the society event of the season if we're going to convince everyone this is real. The next 3 weeks passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations that made Sarah's head spin. The society wedding planner, Mrs. Hartley, orchestrated everything with military precision, transforming Thornfield Manor's grounds into what she called a fairy tale setting worthy of British aristocracy. Sarah stood in what was now her dressing room in the East Wing, staring at her reflection in a full-length mirror. The wedding dress, a bespoke creation by a famous designer she'd never heard of before, cost more than she'd earned in the past year. The delicate lace and silk hugged her figure before flowing into an elegant train, making her look like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. You look absolutely stunning, her father said from his wheelchair by the window. The past few weeks of specialized treatment had already brought some color back to his cheeks. Though I still can't quite believe my little girl is marrying into the Lancaster family. Sarah smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her dress. Neither can I, Dad. She hadn't told him about the arrangement, couldn't bear to. Instead, she'd spun a story about a secret relationship with Alexander that had blossomed during their drives together. Her father seemed skeptical, but chose not to press the issue, perhaps too grateful for the miraculous intervention that had given him access to the best medical care in the country. A knock at the door preceded the entrance of Isabella, Alexander's younger sister. Unlike the rest of the Lancaster family, who maintained a careful distance, Isabella had taken Sarah under her wing, becoming an unexpected ally in navigating high society. "The guests are arriving," Isabella announced, looking elegant in her bridesmaid dress. "And you should see Alexander. I've never seen him so nervous. He's actually wearing his tie properly for once." Sarah's stomach fluttered. She hadn't seen Alexander much during the wedding preparations, as Richard had insisted they maintain some distance to prevent any potential scandals before the big day. Their only interactions had been during formal dance lessons, where they'd learned to waltz together under the stern guidance of a professional instructor. "Is everything ready?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Isabella nodded, adjusting Sarah's veil. "The garden looks magnificent. Mrs. Hartley has outdone herself. Every major society figure in Britain is out there, along with half the board members of Lancaster Holdings." She paused, meeting Sarah's eyes in the mirror. "Are you ready?" Sarah took a deep breath. "As I'll ever be." The ceremony was to take place in the manor's formal gardens, where 1,000 white roses created a fragrant pathway to an elegant arch covered in climbing flowers. As Sarah made her way down from the east wing, she could hear the string quartet playing softly in the distance. Her father insisted on standing for their walk down the aisle, though he needed to lean heavily on his cane. As they emerged into the garden, Sarah's breath caught at the sight before her. The setting was indeed like something from a fairy tale, with delicate white chairs lined up in perfect rows and crystal decorations catching the afternoon sunlight. But what truly captured her attention was Alexander, standing beneath the flower-covered arch. He looked impossibly handsome in his morning suit, his usual casual demeanor replaced by an almost regal bearing. When he turned and saw her, his eyes widened, and for a moment his carefully composed expression slipped, revealing something that looked remarkably like genuine awe. As Sarah walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her. The cream of British society filled the seats, along with business tycoons, politicians, and even a few minor royals. Photographers discreetly captured every moment from designated positions, their presence a reminder that this wedding would be splashed across tomorrow's society pages. When she reached the arch, Alexander stepped forward to take her hand. "You look incredible," he whispered, and for once there wasn't a trace of his usual smirk or playful sarcasm. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. Sarah found herself focusing on the warmth of Alexander's hand in hers, the gentle pressure of his fingers as they exchanged rings. When the moment came for their first kiss as husband and wife, Alexander cupped her face with surprising tenderness. His lips met hers in a kiss that was soft and sweet, yet somehow left her slightly breathless. The reception that followed was a masterclass in upper-class entertainment. Champagne flowed freely, the 5-course meal was exquisite, and the band played a perfect mix of classical music and modern favorites. Sarah found herself twirling from one dance to another, first with Alexander, then with Richard Lancaster, various board members, and even a duke. "Holding up all right, Mrs. Lancaster?" Alexander asked when he finally claimed her for another dance. His use of her new name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "It's rather surreal," she admitted as they waltzed across the floor. "I keep expecting to wake up and find myself back in my flat, getting ready for another day of driving." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Well, you're stuck with me now, at least for the next year. Speaking of which," Sarah lowered her voice, "your father mentioned something about a honeymoon." Alexander grinned. "Ah, yes, 2 weeks in the Maldives. Don't worry, separate rooms in the villa. Father insisted we go somewhere appropriately romantic and exclusive. Can't have the society papers thinking we're anything less than madly in love." As if on cue, several camera flashes went off around them. Alexander pulled her closer, resting his cheek against her temple, in what looked like an intimate gesture but actually allowed him to speak without being observed. "You're doing wonderfully, you know. The board members are impressed, and I've already heard several people commenting on what a stabilizing influence you'll be." Sarah smiled despite herself. "Well, that is rather the point, isn't it?" "Indeed. He pulled back slightly to look at her, his green eyes twinkling. Though I must say, if I had to enter into a marriage of convenience, I'm glad it's with someone who can keep up with my wit. Someone has to keep you in line, she retorted, earning a genuine laugh from him. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself actually enjoying the elaborate celebration. Isabella kept her company during the moments when Alexander was pulled away for business discussions, and even Richard Lancaster seemed to have softened slightly, offering her a rare smile during his father-of-the-groom speech. Later, as they posed for photos cutting the magnificent wedding cake, Alexander leaned close to her ear. "Ready for the next chapter, partner?" Sarah looked up at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. "Partner? Well, we're in this together now, aren't we? Might as well make the best of it." As another round of photos captured their seemingly intimate moment, Sarah realized that perhaps this arrangement wouldn't be as difficult as she'd feared. They might have entered into this marriage for practical reasons, but at least they were facing it as allies. What she couldn't quite explain was the way her heart raced when Alexander smiled at her, or why she kept remembering the gentle pressure of his lips during their wedding kiss. Those weren't supposed to be part of the arrangement at all. The Maldivian sunrise painted the ocean in shades of gold and pink as Sarah stood on the private deck of their luxury villa. 2 weeks had passed since the wedding, and she was still adjusting to the surreal reality of her new life. The honeymoon villa, perched over crystal-clear waters, was larger than her entire former apartment building. "Coffee?" Alexander's voice came from behind her. She turned to find him holding 2 steaming mugs, looking surprisingly domestic in linen pants and a casual white shirt. "Thanks." She accepted the cup, noting how he'd remembered exactly how she took her coffee: 1 sugar, splash of milk. These little details about each other were becoming familiar, despite maintaining their separate spaces in the villa. "The board meeting went well last night," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. The time difference meant he'd been taking video calls in the early hours. "Father says our wedding photos in the Times created exactly the right impression. Apparently, we look genuinely in love." Sarah sipped her coffee to hide her expression. The past 2 weeks had been an exercise in carefully maintained boundaries. They'd settled into a comfortable routine: shared meals, long walks on the beach, evening games of chess on the terrace. But there was always an invisible line neither of them crossed, a reminder that this was all for show. "Speaking of impressions," Alexander continued, "Isabella sent some social media analytics. Our wedding hashtag was trending in London for 3 days. The public seems to love the idea of the rebellious heir being tamed by love." "Tamed?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Is that what we're calling it?" He grinned, the morning sun catching the gold flecks in his green eyes. "Well, I haven't done anything scandalous in weeks. Must be your positive influence. The day's still young." Their playful banter was interrupted by the arrival of breakfast, an extravagant spread of tropical fruits, pastries, and local delicacies. As they settled at the outdoor dining table, Sarah couldn't help but notice how different Alexander was here, away from the pressure of London society and his father's watchful eye. "I've been thinking," he said, reaching for a mango, "about your request to understand the business better. When we get back, would you like to start sitting in on some of my meetings?" Sarah looked up in surprise. "Really? Won't that seem odd to the board members?" "Not at all. Many of our senior executives' spouses take an active interest in the company. Besides," he added with a hint of his old smirk, "you're probably better at financial analysis than I am. Those university entrance scores of yours were impressive." She felt her cheeks warm. During the wedding preparations, she'd caught him looking through her educational records, part of the documentation needed for her upcoming university enrollment. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you." Alexander shrugged, but she could tell he was pleased. Partners, remember? After breakfast, they took their usual morning walk along the beach. Other guests at the exclusive resort nodded respectfully as they passed, no doubt recognizing them from the extensive media coverage of their wedding. Sarah had learned to smile and play her part, her hand tucked into Alexander's arm, looking for all the world like a newlywed in love. "You're getting quite good at this," Alexander murmured, as they passed a group of British tourists who were trying very hard to look like they weren't staring. "I had a good teacher," she replied. "Isabella's lessons in how to be a Lancaster were very thorough." He chuckled, but then his expression grew more serious. "I've been meaning to thank you, actually. not just for agreeing to this whole arrangement, but for how you've handled everything. The press, the society obligations, my father's expectations, you've taken it all in stride." Sarah watched a hermit crab scuttle across their path, considering her response. "It's not entirely selfless. My father's health is improving dramatically with the new treatments, and I start university classes next month. Sometimes I feel like I'm getting the better end of this deal." "Don't sell yourself short," Alexander said, stopping to face her. "You've given up a year of your life to help save my family's company. That's no small thing." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Standing there on the pristine beach, with the morning sun turning his dark hair golden at the edges, he looked nothing like the tabloid playboy she'd spent months driving around London. This version of Alexander, thoughtful, genuine, surprisingly kind, was becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile with her initial impressions of him. A photographer's shutter clicked in the distance, reminding them they were never truly alone. Alexander smoothly pulled her closer, making it appear as though they were sharing an intimate moment. "We should head back," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "I have another board call in an hour." "Of course." Sarah stepped back, trying to ignore the way her skin tingled where his hands had rested on her waist. These reactions to him were becoming more frequent, more difficult to dismiss as mere acting for their audience. As they walked back to the villa, Sarah found herself thinking about the months ahead. They'd return to London in a few days, moving into their separate wings of Thornfield Manor, settling into their roles as the newly reformed heir and his devoted wife. It should have been simple, a business arrangement with clear terms and conditions. But there were moments like this morning, when Alexander looked at her with unguarded warmth in his eyes, or when their hands brushed accidentally over the chessboard, that made her wonder if they were both still following the script. The lines between performance and reality were starting to blur, and Sarah wasn't sure if that thrilled or terrified her more. Back at the villa, as Alexander prepared for his video call, Sarah watched him transform back into the businessman he was learning to be. His casual holiday demeanor shifted into something more polished, more conscious of his responsibilities. "Sarah," he called from his study door, "would you like to sit in on this call? It's with our Asia-Pacific division. Might be good practice for when we're back in London." She smiled, recognizing this for what it was, not just an invitation to learn about the business, but a gesture of trust. "I'd like that." As she settled into a chair beside him, careful to stay out of the camera's view, Sarah realized that their arrangement was evolving into something neither of them had anticipated. They were becoming a team, and somehow that seemed more dangerous than any of the feelings she was trying so hard to ignore. The return to Thornfield Manor brought with it the weight of expectations and scrutiny that their Maldivian paradise had temporarily sheltered them from. Sarah's first week as an official resident of the Lancaster estate coincided with her first term at university, creating a delicate balancing act between her studies and her new social obligations. One particularly hectic Thursday morning found Sarah in the Manor's extensive library, surrounded by textbooks and her laptop, trying to complete an economics assignment before that evening's charity gala. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up to find Alexander leaning against one of the towering bookshelf. "Preparing for Professor Hamilton's class?" he asked, loosening his tie after what she knew had been a challenging morning of meetings. Sarah nodded, surprised he'd remembered her schedule. "The macroeconomic principles are familiar from my self-study, but the professor's approach is rather intense." "Ah, yes. Hamilton's infamous for that." Alexander settled into the leather armchair across from her. "I had him for my first year at Cambridge. Still have nightmares about his pop quizzes." The casual mention of their shared academic interest, despite their vastly different backgrounds, made Sarah smile. These moments of genuine connection were becoming more frequent, weaving themselves into the fabric of their daily lives. "Speaking of economics," Alexander continued, "how would you feel about joining me for lunch with the board's financial committee tomorrow? They're reviewing our quarterly projections, and since you've been sitting in on some meetings—" "Are you sure that's appropriate?" Sarah asked, though she couldn't hide her interest. "Absolutely. Besides, you caught that discrepancy in the Asia-Pacific reports last week that everyone else missed. The committee could use your sharp eyes." Before Sarah could respond, Isabella burst into the library, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "Have you seen this?" She thrust her tablet toward them, displaying the latest society blog headlines. Lancaster's love story, from driver to duchess, the real romance behind the headlines, Sarah read aloud, her stomach tightening. The article was accompanied by photos from their honeymoon, intimate moments they thought had been private. Alexander moved to read over her shoulder, his presence warm and steady behind her. "Well, they're certainly selling the fairy tale angle," he muttered, scanning the text. "Though I must say they've made me sound far more charming than I actually am." "The timing's perfect, actually," Isabella said, perching on the arm of a nearby sofa. "Everyone's talking about you two before tonight's gala. The mysterious illness of Lord Whitworth's wife means you'll be seated at the main table. All eyes will be on the happy couple." Sarah felt Alexander's hand squeeze her shoulder gently. "We can handle it," he said with quiet confidence. "We've had enough practice by now." But practice didn't quite prepare Sarah for the reality of that evening's gala. The event, held at the prestigious Royal Lancaster Hotel, no relation despite the name, was a gathering of Britain's elite in support of children's education. Sarah found herself navigating a minefield of social expectations, careful to maintain the image of the perfect Lancaster wife, while fielding subtle interrogations from curious socialites. "You must tell us," Lady Pembroke gushed over champagne, "how did you manage to capture our most eligible bachelor's heart? We were all quite shocked when the engagement was announced." Sarah felt Alexander's arm slip around her waist, a gesture that had become almost natural over the past weeks. "Actually," he interjected smoothly, "Sarah captured my attention by being the only person brave enough to lecture me about responsible business practices during our drives." "It's true," Sarah added, allowing herself to lean slightly into his embrace. "I once refused to take him to a club, insisting he review contract documents instead. He claims that's when he realized I was different." The story, while technically true, took on a new meaning in the context of their supposed romance. Lady Pembroke ate it up, no doubt already planning to spread the tale throughout her social circle. Later, as they waltzed across the ballroom floor, Sarah marveled at how comfortable they'd become with this elaborate dance of pretense. Alexander's hand rested perfectly at her waist, his steps matching hers, as if they'd been dancing together for years rather than months. "You're thinking too hard," he murmured, guiding her through a turn. "I can practically hear the gears turning in your head. Just wondering what Professor Hamilton would say about the economic implications of these galas," she deflected. "The cost of one centerpiece could probably fund a student's textbooks for a year." Alexander's laugh was genuine. "There's the Sarah I know, always bringing perspective to our privileged bubble." His tone was teasing, but his eyes held genuine appreciation. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and Alexander drew her closer, maintaining their image of newlywed bliss for the watching crowds. Sarah found herself relaxing into his embrace, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, "for supporting my involvement with the company. I know it's not part of our original agreement." "Sarah," his voice was equally quiet, meant only for her ears, "I think we both know we've moved beyond the strict terms of that agreement. You're not just playing a role anymore. You're becoming an actual partner in all of this." The sincerity in his voice made her heart skip a beat. She pulled back slightly to look at him, searching his face for any sign of his usual playful deflection. Instead, she found only earnest appreciation and something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. The moment was broken by the arrival of Richard Lancaster, who smoothly cut in for the next dance. As Alexander reluctantly stepped away, Sarah caught a flash of something in his eyes: frustration, regret, before his social mask slipped back into place. "You're doing remarkably well," Richard commented as they began to dance. "The board is impressed with your growing understanding of the business, and Alexander's behavior has improved significantly. The arrangement appears to be working better than anticipated." Sarah nodded, the word arrangement landing like a weight in her stomach. "Yes, everything is going according to plan." But later that night, as she lay awake in her elegant bedroom in the East Wing, Sarah wondered if anything was really going according to plan at all. The lines between performance and reality were becoming increasingly blurred, and her heart was no longer sure which was which. In the distance, she could hear classical music drifting from Alexander's study in the West Wing, a habit she'd learned meant he was working late. The sound was oddly comforting, a reminder that despite the separate wings and careful boundaries, they were in this together, for better or worse, at least for the next 9 months. The October wind whipped through the gardens of Thornfield Manor, sending crimson leaves dancing across the manicured lawns. Sarah sat in her favorite window seat in the library, attempting to focus on her university assignments, but her attention kept drifting to the upcoming Lancaster Holdings quarterly review. 3 months into their marriage, she had become increasingly involved in the company's operations, much to the board's surprise and apparent approval. Her economics professors often commented on how she applied real-world examples in her essays, unaware that these examples came from first-hand experience in one of Britain's largest corporations. "There you are," Alexander's voice broke through her reverie. He stood in the doorway, his suit jacket draped over one arm, looking unusually agitated. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Sarah closed her laptop. "What's wrong?" "The Morrison deal is falling apart." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she now recognized as a sign of genuine stress. "They're threatening to pull out unless we restructure the entire proposal. But that deal represents 20% of next quarter's projected growth," Sarah said, her mind already racing through the implications. "The board will—" "Exactly." Alexander dropped into the chair opposite her. "Father's in Singapore, and the board expects me to handle this. 3 months ago, I would have probably tried to charm my way through it or thrown money at the problem. Now," he looked at her intently, "I could really use your perspective on this." Without hesitation, Sarah moved to the large desk they often shared for work. "Show me the details." For the next few hours, they pored over contracts and financial projections. Sarah's fresh perspective, combined with Alexander's growing business acumen, led them to identify several alternative approaches. As the grandfather clock struck midnight, they finally had a viable solution. "This is brilliant," Alexander said, reviewing their proposal. "The risk mitigation structure you suggested actually makes the deal more attractive for both parties." He looked up at her with undisguised admiration. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest at his praise. "Well, you did spot the tax implications I missed. We make a good team." "We do, don't we?" His voice was soft, thoughtful. The library's warm lighting cast shadows across his features, highlighting the intensity of his gaze. For a moment, the air between them seemed charged with possibility. The spell was broken by a knock at the door. Phillips, the housekeeper, entered with a tea tray. "I thought you might need some refreshment given the late hour." "Thank you, Mrs. Phillips," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption. These moments of connection with Alexander were becoming more frequent and increasingly difficult to dismiss as part of their arrangement. As they sipped their tea, Alexander's phone buzzed with a message. "Isabella's invited us to her cottage in the Cotswolds this weekend. Apparently she's throwing one of her famous autumn parties." "That sounds lovely, but I have that economics paper due." "Already finished, isn't it?" He raised an eyebrow knowingly. "I saw you working on the conclusion yesterday." Sarah smiled, caught out. "You're paying attention." "I always pay attention when it comes to you," he said quietly, then quickly added, "Besides, it would look odd if we didn't attend. The society pages are already wondering why we haven't been seen at any country house parties lately." The weekend found them driving through the picturesque Cotswolds countryside in Alexander's Aston Martin. The autumn colors were at their peak, painting the landscape in rich golds and crimsons. Sarah found herself relaxing as they left London's pressures behind. "You know," Alexander said as they wound through narrow country lanes, "I used to hate these weekend gatherings. All the social obligations, the constant networking, the expectations. But lately, with you there, they've become almost enjoyable." Sarah glanced at his profile, noting how different he looked from the reckless playboy she'd first met. "Is that because I keep you away from the whiskey cabinet?" He laughed. "Partly, but mostly it's because you make everything feel more real, less like a performance." The irony of his words wasn't lost on her, given that their entire marriage was supposed to be a performance. Before she could respond, they arrived at Isabella's cottage, a cottage that turned out to be a substantial country house with extensive grounds. Isabella greeted them warmly, but Sarah caught a knowing look in her eye as she watched them together. "I've put you in the blue room," she said. "It has the best view of the gardens. It wasn't until they reached the room that they realized Isabella had given them a single bedroom, unlike their usual separate arrangements at home. They stood in the doorway, both suddenly awkward. "I can sleep on the chaise," Alexander offered immediately. "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah said, trying to sound practical. "The bed is enormous. We're both adults. We can share it." That evening's party was an intimate affair by Lancaster standards, only 30 guests rather than the usual 100. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the relaxed atmosphere, watching as Alexander charmed the room with a new kind of confidence that had nothing to do with his former wild behavior. "He's different with you," Isabella commented, joining Sarah by the fireplace. "More himself somehow." "We've just gotten better at the pretense," Sarah said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Isabella gave her a penetrating look. "Are you sure that's all it is?" Before Sarah could respond, Alexander appeared at her side with mulled wine. His hand found its usual place at the small of her back, but tonight the touch seemed to burn through the silk of her dress. Later, as they prepared for bed with careful courtesy, Sarah couldn't help but be aware of Alexander's presence. The sound of his breathing, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way the moonlight played across his features as they lay in the darkness. "Sarah?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Yes? Thank you for being here, for all of this. I know it's not what you signed up for, becoming so involved in everything." She turned to face him, barely visible in the darkness. "I think we both got more than we bargained for." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Alexander reached across the space between them and took her hand, interlacing their fingers. They fell asleep like that, connected by that simple touch, while outside the autumn wind whispered secrets neither of them was ready to acknowledge. December transformed Thornfield Manor into something out of a Victorian Christmas card, with frost glazing the windows and garlands adorning every doorway. Sarah sat in the conservatory, surrounded by holiday decorations and financial reports, trying to focus on the upcoming board meeting while snow fell softly outside. "Hot chocolate?" Alexander appeared with 2 steaming mugs, looking casual in a cashmere sweater that made his green eyes appear even more striking. "How you've been staring at those reports for hours." "Thank you." She accepted the mug gratefully, noting the tiny marshmallows floating on top, exactly how she liked it. These small gestures of thoughtfulness had become commonplace between them, each one making their arrangement feel less like an agreement and more like something real. "The Morrison deal implementation is going beautifully," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "The board is thrilled. Father actually smiled during the last video conference. I thought his face might crack." Sarah laughed, remembering Richard Lancaster's unusually warm acknowledgement of their joint success. "We do make a good team." "Speaking of teams," Alexander shifted slightly, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "The annual Lancaster Holdings Christmas Ball is next week. I know we've attended plenty of events together, but this one's different. It's more personal," Sarah supplied. "Because it's your family's tradition?" He nodded. "Exactly. And this year, because of how well the company's doing, it's going to be bigger than ever. The press will be there, all the major business figures, even some minor royalty." "Alexander," she reached out and touched his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the past months. "We'll handle it like we handle everything else. Together." His fingers intertwined with hers, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence watching the snow fall. The warmth of his hand seemed to spread through Sarah's entire body, making her acutely aware of how close they were sitting. "Sarah," he began, his voice soft, but was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Phillips. "Mr. Lancaster, your sister is on the phone. Something about the ball's seating arrangements." Alexander reluctantly released Sarah's hand. "Duty calls. But we'll continue this conversation later." She nodded, watching him leave while trying to quiet her racing heart. These moments between them were becoming more frequent, more charged with unspoken emotions that neither of them dared to name. The week leading up to the Christmas ball was a whirlwind of preparations. Sarah divided her time between her final university exams for the term and helping Isabella with the event planning. The great hall of Thornfield Manor was transformed into a winter wonderland, with crystal snowflakes suspended from the ceiling and ice sculptures glittering among white roses. On the evening of the ball, Sarah stood before her mirror, smoothing the fabric of her gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that seemed to catch every light in the room. A knock at her door revealed Isabella, already dressed in emerald green. "He won't know what hit him," Isabella said with a knowing smile. "Who?" "My dear brother, of course, though I suppose you'll tell me again that it's all for show." Sarah busied herself with her earrings, avoiding Isabella's keen gaze. "The arrangement has worked out well for everyone. The company is thriving, your father is pleased, and I'm able to pursue my education. And the way you look at each other when you think no one's watching, is that part of the arrangement too?" Before Sarah could respond, there was another knock. Alexander stood in the doorway, looking devastating in his tuxedo. He stopped short when he saw her, his expression making Sarah's breath catch. "You look," he seemed to struggle for words, "absolutely beautiful." Isabella slipped out with a knowing smile, leaving them alone. Alexander crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "I have something for you," he said, producing a velvet box. Inside was a delicate diamond necklace that caught the light like captured stars. "It was my mother's. Father suggested I should give it to my wife, and well, it belongs with you." Sarah's fingers trembled as he fastened it around her neck, his touch lingering longer than necessary. "Alexander, I can't—" "You can," he said firmly. "Whatever this is between us, whatever it's becoming, you deserve this." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of arriving guests. They made their way downstairs, falling into their familiar routine of playing the perfect couple. But something felt different tonight. Every touch seemed to linger. Every shared glance held more meaning. The ball was a spectacular success. Sarah and Alexander moved through the crowds with practiced ease, their natural chemistry apparent to everyone watching. They danced together, his hand warm on her waist, her head occasionally resting against his shoulder when the music slowed. "You've transformed him," an elderly board member commented to Sarah during dinner. "We all feared he'd never take his responsibilities seriously, but look at him now, the very image of a proper business leader." Sarah watched Alexander across the room, noting how confidently he handled a group of international investors. "He always had it in him," she said softly. "He just needed someone to believe in him." Later, as the evening drew to a close, they found themselves alone in the conservatory. The snow was falling harder now, creating a peaceful backdrop to the sound of distant music and laughter. "Dance with me?" Alexander held out his hand. "No audience this time. Just us." Sarah stepped into his arms, and they swayed gently to the faint music. The diamond necklace sparkled in the moonlight, but it was nothing compared to the warmth in Alexander's eyes as he looked at her. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk about what's happening between us." Her heart seemed to stop and race at the same time. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm finding it increasingly difficult to remember that this is supposed to be just an arrangement. Every time you smile at me, every time you challenge me in meetings, every time you understand exactly what I'm thinking, without me having to say it." He took a deep breath. "I'm not pretending anymore. I don't think I have been for a while." Before Sarah could respond, a commotion from the ballroom interrupted them. Isabella appeared looking apologetic. "I'm so sorry, but the Minister of Finance is leaving and insists on saying goodbye to both of you." They shared a look of frustrated understanding before returning to their duties as host and hostess. But something had shifted between them, something that couldn't be ignored or unnamed any longer. As the last guests departed and the manor grew quiet, Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the snow transform the grounds into a blank canvas. Her fingers traced the diamonds at her throat, and she wondered if perhaps it was time to admit that their carefully constructed arrangement had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, something real, precious, and increasingly impossible to deny. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought an unusual calm to Thornfield Manor. Most of the staff had been given leave for the holidays, and even Richard Lancaster was away on a business trip to New York. The massive house felt different somehow, more intimate, less like a stage where Sarah and Alexander performed their carefully choreographed roles. Sarah spent her mornings in the library, reviewing her excellent first-term university results and getting ahead on reading for the next semester. The quiet was occasionally broken by the sound of Alexander's footsteps as he passed by, each time pausing as if considering whether to enter, then continuing on his way. They were dancing around each other, both aware that their almost conversation at the Christmas ball had shifted something fundamental between them. Their usual easy companionship had become charged with unspoken words and meaningful glances. It was New Year's Eve when everything finally changed. Sarah was in the kitchen, attempting to bake scones using her grandmother's recipe, when Alexander found her. "I thought I smelled something burning," he teased, leaning against the doorframe. Sarah looked up from her flour-covered cookbook, brushing a strand of hair from her face and leaving a smudge of white on her cheek. "I'll have you know these are perfectly golden brown." Alexander crossed the room, reaching out to wipe the flour from her face. His touch lingered, and suddenly the kitchen felt very small. "Sarah," he said softly, "we need to finish that conversation." Her heart began to race. "Which conversation?" "The one about how this isn't just an arrangement anymore, at least not for me." Before she could respond, the oven timer buzzed insistently. Sarah stepped back, grateful for the interruption, as she busied herself with removing the scones. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the cooling rack. "They actually look quite good," Alexander commented, but his voice was tense with unresolved emotion. "Would you like to try one?" "With proper clotted cream and jam, of course. I found some in the pantry that Mrs. Phillips must have—" "Sarah," his voice was gentle but firm, "please look at me." She turned slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. The affection she saw there made her breath catch. "6 months ago," he began, "I agreed to this marriage because it was the responsible thing to do. It was a business arrangement, pure and simple. But somewhere between your lectures about fiscal responsibility and your genuine belief in my potential, something changed." Sarah gripped the edge of the counter behind her. "Alexander, let me finish, please." He took a step closer. "You've become more than just my partner in this charade. You're the first person I want to talk to when something good happens at work. You're the one whose opinion I value most. You're the reason I actually want to be better, not just for the company or my father's approval, but for myself." "This wasn't supposed to happen," Sarah whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. "No, it wasn't." He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. "But it has. I'm falling in love with you, Sarah. Actually, if I'm being completely honest, I think I already have." The words hung in the air between them, making everything else seem suddenly insignificant. The arrangement, the company, their carefully maintained boundaries. "Say something," he urged, when she remained silent. Sarah looked down at her flour-covered hands, then back up at him. "I'm scared," she admitted. "This wasn't part of the plan. If we acknowledge this, if we change things, what if it ruins everything? Or what if it makes everything better?" His hand found hers, flour and all. "We've been pretending so long that I think we forgot we're allowed to feel something real. The agreement with your father was about proving I could be responsible, about saving the company. Look at our quarterly reports, Sarah. Look at how well we work together. We've more than fulfilled that part of the bargain." She couldn't help but smile. "You really have changed, you know. The Alexander I first met would never have quoted quarterly reports in a romantic moment." He laughed, drawing her closer. "That's entirely your influence. You've made me better in ways I didn't even know I needed." "You've changed me too," she admitted softly. "Helped me believe in myself, in my abilities. Given me opportunities I never thought possible. Then why are we fighting this?" Sarah looked up at him, at this man who was so different from the reckless playboy she'd agreed to marry. "Because I'm afraid of losing what we have. Because I've seen what happens to real relationships under the pressure of your world. Because you love me too," he finished quietly. The truth of it hit her like a physical force. She did love him, had been falling in love with him gradually, day by day, moment by moment. Every shared smile, every late-night discussion, every small gesture of understanding had brought them to this point. "Yes," she whispered, "I love you too." Alexander's smile was radiant as he cupped her face in his hands. This time, when his lips met hers, there was no audience to perform for, no photographers to capture the moment. It was real and honest and perfect, even with the smell of slightly overdone scones in the air and flour on their clothes. When they finally parted, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "So, Mrs. Lancaster, what do you say we start the new year by being honest with ourselves? No more pretending." Sarah smiled, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. "I'd like that. Although we should probably work on your baking skills as part of this new arrangement." He laughed, pulling her close again. "I'll agree to anything as long as it means I get to love you properly. without wondering if every moment between us is real or just for show. As the snow fell softly outside and the kitchen clock ticked closer to midnight, Sarah and Alexander remained wrapped in each other's arms, no longer bound by the terms of their original agreement, but by something far more powerful, love that had grown naturally, unexpectedly, and undeniably real. January brought more than just a new year to Thornfield Manor. The atmosphere had shifted subtly but significantly since New Year's Eve, with Sarah and Alexander no longer carefully maintaining their distance. Their new dynamic didn't go unnoticed, particularly by the ever-observant Isabella. "Something's different," she commented one morning, finding them sharing breakfast in the conservatory rather than their usual separate routines. "You two seem happier," Alexander smiled, reaching across the table to take Sarah's hand openly, no longer feeling the need to justify the gesture. "We've decided to stop pretending." Isabella's delighted squeal echoed through the glass-enclosed space. "Finally! I've been watching you two dance around your feelings for months." Sarah blushed, but didn't withdraw her hand from Alexander's. "We needed time to figure things out for ourselves." Their newfound happiness, however, was soon tested by the realities of their public life. The society papers, always eager for Lancaster family news, picked up on the change in their relationship. Headlines began appearing. Lancaster's arranged marriage turns to true love, and from business deal to real romance, the Lancaster love story. "They're not entirely wrong," Alexander mused, reading the latest article over Sarah's shoulder in his study. "Though I could do without the dramatic speculation about our private life." Sarah leaned back against him, still marveling at how natural such intimacy now felt. At least they're focusing on the positive. "No more stories about your wild past or questioning my motives." "Speaking of the past," Alexander said, his tone growing serious, "the annual shareholders' meeting is next week. Father wants us both there." The meeting would be their first major public appearance since acknowledging their feelings for each other. It would also mark nearly 7 months since their arrangement began, with the original one-year agreement more than halfway complete. The day of the meeting arrived with its usual fanfare. Sarah sat beside Alexander at the long boardroom table, her presence now accepted and even welcomed by the company's senior leadership. As Richard Lancaster presented the year's extraordinary financial results, she felt Alexander's hand find hers beneath the table. "And much of our success," Richard was saying, "can be attributed to the remarkable partnership between my son and his wife. Their joint handling of the Morrison deal alone has increased our market share by 15%. The pride in Richard's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt Alexander straighten beside her. Gone was the rebellious heir who needed to be controlled. In his place sat a confident business leader who had earned his position through hard work and dedication. After the meeting, Richard called them both into his office. "The board is more than satisfied with your performance, Alexander. And Sarah, your contributions have exceeded all expectations." "Thank you, Father," Alexander said, his hand resting protectively on the small of Sarah's back. Richard's sharp eyes didn't miss the gesture or the natural way they gravitated toward each other. "I see things have changed between you two." "Yes," Sarah admitted, lifting her chin. "They have." To their surprise, Richard smiled, a genuine, warm expression they rarely saw. "Good. I had hoped this might happen, though I didn't dare count on it." "You what?" Alexander stared at his father in disbelief. "Son, I've watched you chase after meaningless relationships for years, trying to fill some void you couldn't even name. But Sarah, she challenges you, supports you, makes you want to be better. I saw the potential for something real between you two long before either of you did." "So the arrangement," Sarah began, "was necessary to get you both to see what was possible." Richard's eyes twinkled with unexpected mischief. "Sometimes the best business strategies require a bit of personal manipulation." Alexander shook his head, laughing despite himself. "You orchestrated this whole thing." "I merely created the opportunity. You two did the rest yourselves." Richard stood, moving to his drinks cabinet. "Now, I believe this calls for a celebration. Not of our business success, though that's certainly worth celebrating, but of something far more valuable, real love growing in its own time, in its own way." As they shared a toast, Sarah felt overwhelmed by how much had changed. She had entered this arrangement desperate to help her father and pursue her education. Now halfway through the agreed-upon year, She had gained so much more: confidence in her abilities, respect in the business world, and most importantly, a love she never expected to find. Later that evening, as they walked through the manor's winter garden, Alexander pulled her close. "You know, we don't have to wait for the year to be up anymore. We could make this official, really official, with a ceremony that's about us, not about business arrangements." Sarah turned in his arms, smiling up at him. "Are you proposing to me, Mr. Lancaster?" "Again?" "I suppose I am, Mrs. Lancaster. Only this time there are no contracts involved, just us and how much I love you." Their kiss was interrupted by a flash of light. One of the ever-present society photographers had managed to capture the moment through the garden's glass walls. But for once, neither of them cared about the headlines this would generate. "Let them write what they want," Alexander said, pulling Sarah closer. "For once, the truth is better than any story they could invent." As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Sarah reflected on how life's greatest gifts often come disguised as business arrangements, and how love finds its way even through the most carefully constructed facades. Their performance had become reality. Their pretense had transformed into truth, and their arranged marriage had blossomed into something far more precious than either of them had ever imagined possible. As March painted Thornfield Manor's gardens with the first blush of spring blossoms, Sarah found herself juggling final preparations for her upcoming graduation ceremony with plans for what Alexander called their real wedding. After their spontaneous second proposal in the winter garden had made headlines, they decided to renew their vows in a ceremony that would celebrate their genuine love rather than their business arrangement. "I think you're missing the point," Sarah said one evening, finding Alexander surrounded by wedding magazines in the library. "We don't need another grand society event. We already had that." He looked up, his green eyes sparkling with determination. "Exactly. We had what everyone else wanted. This time it's about what we want." Sarah settled beside him on the sofa, curling into his embrace with the natural ease that still amazed her. "And what exactly do you want, Mr. Lancaster?" "I want to stand up in front of our closest friends and family, not business associates or society photographers, and tell you exactly how much I love you. I want to make vows that aren't written by lawyers or witnessed by board members." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I want to marry you properly, Sarah, because I choose to, not because of any arrangement." His sincerity made her heart swell. "When did you become such a romantic?" "Probably around the time you made me read those Jane Austen novels for your literature course." They were interrupted by Isabella, who burst into the library with her usual enthusiasm. "The press release about your vow renewal ceremony has generated quite a response. Everyone loves the idea of the arranged marriage that turned into true love. You're becoming quite the fairy tale." "Speaking of fairy tales," Alexander said, "how are the plans for Sarah's graduation celebration coming along?" Isabella's eyes lit up. "Everything's arranged. The garden party will be perfect, intimate but elegant. Father's invited some key business figures who are particularly interested in Sarah's thesis on sustainable corporate governance." Sarah still found it surreal that her academic work had caught the attention of Britain's business elite. Her unique position as both a Lancaster and a serious student of economics had opened doors she never imagined possible. "Have you told her about your surprise yet?" Isabella asked Alexander, then immediately clapped a hand over her mouth. "Oh, I wasn't supposed to mention that," Alexander groaned. "No, I haven't, and you're terrible at keeping secrets." "What surprise?" Sarah asked, looking between them. "Well, since my sister has already spoiled it partially." Alexander shifted to face her properly. "I've been working with Father to create a new position within Lancaster Holdings. We want to establish a corporate responsibility division, focusing on sustainable business practices and ethical governance, all the things you're passionate about, and we want you to head it." Sarah stared at him, speechless. "But I've only just finished my degree. You've also spent the past 9 months practically running parts of the company with me. The board has seen your capabilities firsthand. This isn't nepotism, Sarah. You've earned this." "He's right," Isabella added. "The board voted unanimously in favor of the proposal. They're quite impressed with how you've influenced both the company's direction and Alexander's leadership style." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the opportunity. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Alexander encouraged. "Build something that's truly yours within the company." Show everyone that Sarah Lancaster is more than just the woman who reformed the Playboy heir. His use of her married name, a name she had taken as part of an arrangement but now wore with pride, brought tears to her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. Then more firmly, "Yes, of course I'll do it." Their celebration was interrupted by Mrs. Phillips, who announced that Richard Lancaster had returned early from his business trip and wanted to see them both. They found Richard in his study, looking unusually relaxed. "Ah, good. I assume Alexander has told you about the new position?" Sarah nodded. "I'm honored by the opportunity, sir." "Richard," he corrected gently. "I think it's time you called me Richard. After all, you've proven to be more of a true Lancaster than some of our blood relatives." He smiled at his son. "And you've given me back the son I always knew Alexander could be." "Father," Alexander began, but Richard held up a hand. "Let me finish. When I proposed this arrangement last year, I hoped for a business solution to a business problem. Instead, I've witnessed both of you grow into exactly who you were meant to be. Together." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew an envelope. "Which is why I want you to have this." Inside was a deed to a beautiful Victorian townhouse in Kensington. "The east and west wings of the manor have served their purpose," Richard said, "but I think it's time you had a home of your own, where you can build your life together properly." Sarah felt Alexander's arm tighten around her waist, as they both understood the magnitude of this gesture. Richard Lancaster was not just giving them a house, he was giving them his blessing to truly forge their own path. Later that evening, as they walked through what would soon be their new home, Sarah marveled at how differently she saw everything now. The grand rooms didn't intimidate her anymore. Instead, she saw possibilities. A library where they could work together, a kitchen where she could keep attempting to bake while Alexander teased her, a garden where they could build their future. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Alexander asked, pulling her close as they stood in what would be their bedroom. "I was just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I was driving you home from parties, wondering how I was going to pay my father's medical bills. Now you're about to graduate with honors, take on an executive position at one of Britain's largest companies, and renew your vows with your hopelessly in love husband." He kissed her softly. "Not bad for a year's work." Sarah laughed against his lips. "When you put it that way, I love you," he said suddenly, seriously. "Not because of any arrangement or agreement, but because you make me want to be better every single day. Because you believe in me even when I doubt myself. Because you're simply you, Sarah." As the spring evening settled around their new home, Sarah held her husband close, grateful for the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Their arrangement had given them a beginning, but their love had given them a future, one they would build together, no contracts required. The private garden of their new Kensington home bloomed with white roses and lilies, creating an intimate paradise for the small gathering of guests. Unlike their first wedding, with its hundreds of society figures and business associates, this vow renewal ceremony included only their closest family and friends, exactly 30 people who had witnessed their journey from arrangement to true love. Sarah stood before her bedroom mirror, smoothing the silk of her dress, a simple, elegant creation that couldn't have been more different from her original elaborate wedding gown. This time, every choice had been made from the heart, not for appearance or social expectations. "Ready?" Isabella asked, adjusting the small cluster of fresh flowers in Sarah's hair. "Alexander's practically wearing a groove in the garden path, pacing." "How different from our first wedding," Sarah mused. "Then he was so calm, so sure about the arrangement. Now he's nervous about a ceremony that isn't even legally necessary." "That's because this time it matters more," Isabella said softly. "This time it's real." Sarah's father knocked on the door, looking healthier than he had in years thanks to the continued treatments. "The garden's ready, sweetheart. And that husband of yours is about to drive everyone mad with his fidgeting." The garden ceremony setup was exactly as Sarah had envisioned. Simple, elegant, and deeply personal. Wooden chairs were arranged in an intimate semicircle, with a flower-covered arch creating a natural altar. Alexander stood waiting, and the look on his face when he saw her made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Richard Lancaster, who had insisted on officiating this informal ceremony, smiled warmly as Sarah joined Alexander beneath the arch. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the garden, creating a moment that felt almost magical. "A year ago," Richard began. "We gathered for what we thought was a business arrangement. Today we celebrate something far more precious, the real love that grew from that unlikely beginning." Alexander took Sarah's hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly. This strong, confident man, who now commanded boardrooms with ease, was nervous about expressing his feelings in front of their closest loved ones. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "when I agreed to marry you, I thought I was just doing what was necessary to save my position in the company. I had no idea I was actually saving myself. You saw through every pretense, every wall I'd built. You challenged me to be better, not for the business or my father's approval, but for myself. You made me want to be worthy of you." Tears gleamed in Sarah's eyes as he continued. "You helped me understand what real strength looks like, not in grand gestures or public displays, but in daily choices and quiet determination. You taught me that true success isn't measured in profit margins, but in the lives we touch and the love we share. I stand here today not because of any arrangement or obligation, but because I choose you, Sarah. I love you, and I want to spend every day proving worthy of the faith you've placed in me." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself before speaking her own vows. "Alexander, our story began as a business arrangement, but it became so much more. You gave me opportunities I never dreamed possible, but more importantly, you gave me the confidence to seize them. You supported my education, encouraged my ambitions, and showed me that I belonged in your world not because of our arrangement, but because of who I am." She squeezed his hands gently, drawing strength from his touch. "Everyone thought I changed you, but the truth is we changed each other. You helped me believe in myself, in my abilities, in my right to dream big. What started as a contract became a partnership, and that partnership blossomed into the deepest love I've ever known. I choose you, Alexander, not because of any agreement, but because you make me better, stronger, happier, because loving you is the most natural thing I've ever done." Isabella sniffled audibly from her seat, and even Richard had to clear his throat before continuing the ceremony. When Alexander kissed his bride, it was nothing like the polite, practiced kiss from their first wedding. This was a kiss of true love, of promises made from the heart rather than on paper. The intimate dinner that followed was filled with laughter and joy. Sarah's father gave a touching speech about how he'd worried about the arrangement at first, but had watched love grow between them day by day. Isabella shared funny stories about their obvious attraction, even when they were trying to maintain professional distance. Later, as they danced together in their garden under strings of twinkling lights, Alexander pulled Sarah close. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Agreeing to the arrangement that day in Father's study?" Sarah smiled up at him. "How could I regret the decision that led me to true love? Though I do think your father is looking rather smug about how well his plan worked out." "He should be," Alexander chuckled. "He managed to save the company, reform his wayward son, and gain a brilliant daughter-in-law who's about to revolutionize corporate responsibility in British business. Not bad for one arranged marriage." As the evening drew to a close, their guests departed with warm hugs and heartfelt congratulations. Sarah and Alexander stood in their garden, his arms wrapped around her from behind as they watched the last of the sunset fade into twilight. "So, Mrs. Lancaster," he murmured against her ear, "ready to begin the next chapter of our story? This time without any contracts or conditions?" Sarah turned in his arms, reaching up to trace his beloved face. "I think we've proven that the best things in life can't be arranged or contracted. They have to grow naturally, like love." As Alexander leaned down to kiss her, Sarah marveled at how life's greatest gifts often come disguised as business arrangements, and how the heart knows better than any contract what's truly meant to be. 1 year and 6 months after their original wedding, Sarah sat in her spacious office at Lancaster Holdings, reviewing the latest sustainability report from her corporate responsibility division. The wall of windows behind her desk offered a stunning view of London's skyline, but her attention was drawn to the framed photographs on her desk. Their first wedding, all business and formality. Their vow renewal, pure joy and love. And the most recent addition, a picture of Alexander holding their newborn daughter, Eleanor Isabella Lancaster. A soft knock at her door made her look up. Alexander stood there, looking every bit the capable CEO he'd become, but his eyes held the same warmth they'd had since they'd acknowledged their love that New Year's Eve. "Ready for the board meeting?" he asked, crossing the room to drop a kiss on her head. "Father's particularly excited about your presentation on the new ethical investment initiative." Sarah gathered her materials, pausing to straighten Alexander's tie, a gesture that had become their private ritual. "Who would have thought that the arrangement your father crafted would lead to all of this?" The board meeting room was packed with familiar faces. Richard Lancaster sat at the head of the table, looking pleased as Sarah and Alexander presented their joint vision for the company's future. The rebellious heir and his chauffeur had transformed into one of Britain's most respected business partnerships, their love story becoming almost legendary in corporate circles. "The Lancaster Holdings Ethical Business Institute will open its doors next month," Sarah concluded her presentation. "We'll be offering scholarships to promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds, giving them the same opportunity for education that changed my life." The board's approval was unanimous, and Richard's pride was evident as he watched his son and daughter-in-law field questions with expertise and confidence. After the meeting, he held them back. "It's been exactly 18 months since your wedding day," he said, his expression thoughtful. "I remember standing in this very room, wondering if my gamble would pay off." "You mean your carefully orchestrated matchmaking scheme?" Alexander teased, his arm sliding naturally around Sarah's waist. "Call it what you will," Richard smiled. "But look at what it's produced. A stronger company, a more responsible corporate culture, a united family, and—" his eyes softened as he glanced at the photo of baby Eleanor on his desk. "A beautiful granddaughter to carry on the Lancaster legacy." Later that evening, Sarah and Alexander walked through their garden pushing Eleanor's pram. The spring air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers, and the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. "Sometimes I still can't believe how everything turned out," Sarah mused, watching their daughter sleep peacefully. "That day when your father proposed the arrangement, I was so desperate to help my own father, to continue my education. I never imagined I'd find true love." Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her. "Do you remember what you said to me that first day? About how we needed to be honest with each other if the arrangement was going to work?" Sarah nodded, smiling at the memory. "That honesty laid the foundation for everything else," he continued. "It let us see each other clearly, beyond the roles we were supposed to play. It let us fall in love naturally, authentically." A soft cry from the pram interrupted them. Alexander lifted Eleanor into his arms with practiced ease, and Sarah's heart swelled watching them together. Their daughter had her father's green eyes and her mother's determined expression, a perfect blend of them both. "I've been thinking," Alexander said as they resumed their walk, "about how to mark the official end of our original arrangement." "Oh." Sarah raised an eyebrow, recognizing the tone he used when he had a particular idea in mind. "Well, technically the contract was for 1 year. We've now been married for 18 months, and I think it's time we formally acknowledge that the arrangement has evolved into something far more meaningful." He handed Eleanor to Sarah and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Inside was a beautiful eternity ring, decorated with alternating diamonds and sapphires. "Sarah Lancaster," he said softly, "will you stay married to me? Not because of any arrangement or agreement, but simply because we love each other." Sarah laughed through happy tears. "That's the 3rd time you've proposed to me, you know. And I'll keep proposing for the rest of our lives if it means I get to keep you," he said, sliding the ring onto her finger alongside her wedding band. Eleanor cooed in Sarah's arms, reaching for the sparkly new addition to her mother's hand. They both laughed, and Alexander wrapped his arms around his family. "Look at what we've built together," he murmured. "A love story that began with a business arrangement and grew into something real and lasting. A family. A legacy of positive change in the business world." Sarah leaned back against him, feeling completely content. "Who would have thought that signing that contract in your father's study would lead to all of this?" "I think that's the beauty of it," Alexander replied. "Some things can't be arranged or contracted. They have to grow on their own in their own time, like love, like us." As the sun set on their garden, Sarah reflected on how far they'd come from that first meeting in Richard's study. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had blossomed into the truest love story she could have imagined. Their journey had transformed not only their lives but also the lives of others through their work at Lancaster Holdings. The contract that brought them together had expired long ago, but the love that grew from it would last a lifetime. Sarah, Alexander, and little Eleanor were proof that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from unexpected arrangements, and that true love finds its way even through the most businesslike of beginnings.